Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical, environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko in Berkeley, California.
This is a unique moment.
Green and Red first, yeah.
Yeah, unique moment in the history of the Green and Red podcast where Bob and I are recording from the same house. And we
really
have
left out here.
Yeah.
You guys don't have the budget to fly me out to Berkeley also?
Yeah. We're working on that.
We're trying to get Soros money, you know.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
We're joined today by our friend and comrade, Will Potter. And we're going to be talking about current events, but with an eye towards some of what we can expect in the coming days and months and years. Will is a thought leader and award-winning investigative journalist and author whose work is focused on social justice movements and attacks on civil rights post 9/11. It seems like we're in a very different era, but we're going to talk about that. Will has a long bio, which I'm probably not going to get into all of it, but it'll be in the show notes. But the couple of things I do want to point out is that Will had a book called Green is the New Red, an insider's account of social movements under siege, which exposed the targeting of nonviolent protest groups by the FBI and was awarded a Kirkus Star for most remarkable merit. Will has been the inaugural civil rights fellow and distinguished journalist in residence at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. And then also, Will has a new book coming out called Little Red Barns, Hiding the Truth from Farm to Fable, which is now available for pre-order, which is very exciting. So, Will, welcome back to the Green and Red podcast.
Thank you both. It's good to see you and to talk to you about all this.
Yeah, and so I think last time we talked to you was a year or two ago, and then, as we are now, we're in the midst of a serious rollback of First Amendment protected activities. We saw states passing anti-protest legislation, increasing militarization of the police, surveillance, increasing on activist groups. We also see civil litigation against activist groups, which maybe we'll get into a little bit. But now we're also on the eve of the re-inauguration of Donald Trump, who has threatened to deal with the enemy within, use military force against protesters. I believe yesterday, the Secretary of Defense nominee, Pete Hegseth, actually was asked if he supported shooting protesters in the leg, of which he wouldn't really answer. We also have a NGO killer bill, which is going through Congress right now. A lot's going on in this realm around civil liberties and repression and things. And so what are your thoughts, Will, about what we're headed into in the next Trump administration?
Yeah, I don't really have a lot of thoughts on that, Scott. It's just like disorienting, isn't it? It feels like this onslaught that we know exactly what's coming. I think it's not just predictable, but it's being broadcast and advertised and promised. And at the same time, it just feels quite disorienting. Some of the things I'm bracing for are really just an acceleration and escalation of a lot of the trends we've been seeing for a number of years. The one thing I think we need to understand and remember about state repression is it's never particularly innovative. It might feel that way, and I feel that way some days right now. You referenced some of these like new developments going after nonprofits and particularly those supporting Palestinians, the attacks on bail funds and legal defense groups that we've seen in Cop City that I'm sure we can talk about. But a lot of these are really just regurgitations of tried and true tactics we've seen in a lot of other periods of US history. So that's all to say that I think we're going to see an acceleration of this. I think we're going to see a return to periods of state repression that we'd like to think are in a distant past. Frankly, I think there's going to be much more direct attacks on clearly lawful above ground nonprofit groups. I think there's going to be a steady rollback of First Amendment protections, especially in relations to protests and gatherings where there might be far right or elected officials present as a starting point. And I think we're going to see also kind of a steady expansion of these tactics internationally, which is something that we haven't talked a lot about in the press or in this kind of discussion about Trump, is how all of these policies that we've seen in the US over decades now related to labeling activists as terrorists and prosecuting them and treating them that way have become like an international blueprint that's happening all over the globe right now. And I think, and I'm concerned that some of the trends we'll see here in the States are going to be copycats in other countries and other domestic terrorism operations as well.
The bigger question is, I'm thinking of 2017 to 2021, the first Trump term. And in that period, which was very bad, but there was opposition, let's call it, from the media, even from some Democrats, because it was directed at how bad Trump was. And what we're seeing now, I think, is all these people are capitulated to him. Do you think it's going to take on different forms and maybe even be more virulent in the coming days?
That's what scares me precisely, because I think it's a couple things that are happening. One is exactly what you said. There's an outright capitulation. We saw from Zuckerberg's, it's all the billionaire bootlicking, right? That they're seeing the writing on the wall. They want to have their skin in the game and make sure they're getting paid, and they're kissing the ring, licking the boots, whatever metaphor you want to use. But it's not necessarily surprising, but it's so craven and a little shocking. I think you're right also that there were a couple phases with the first Trump presidency after the liberal intellectuals and academia and the press and advocacy groups moved out of this he's a joke phase to realizing like, oh, he's actually going to be the president. There's a shift in kind of a united front, like you said. I'm fearing that we're entering this cultural moment where it feels like it shifted from Trump being the joke to Trump being real to now Trump being like the status quo in a way, like that everyone else is acclimating to and adjusting to, from the Republican Party to the billionaires to, I'm seeing it in different nonprofit groups as they're trying to determine how to navigate these next 4 years at minimum. They don't want to veer away from their mission statements. They can't just stop doing this work. And so and I'm hearing this from a lot of folks, trying to balance what is their tone. Can they use the F word? Can they call this authoritarianism even? What is the language and the level of defiance they have now that we know this really is not going away in a really pivotal moment, frankly, in terms of the climate crisis and a free society? So that's what fears me. I look, and I've done a lot of scholarship around the Spanish Civil War and World War II and resistance movements. And there are quotes that I've heard a Werner Herzog version, I've heard a Sinclair Lewis version, but it all boils down to this idea of, in these moments, you start realizing how society fractures into these components of people that are outright believers and zealots for this hate and the xenophobia and all the stuff that's here. There are people that are actively trying to fight back and resist it. And then there's an equal body or a larger body that's just going along and paying attention to gas prices and going to their job and their family and whatever else. And I don't know about you all, but I'm feeling that really strongly right now. And I feel like I'm seeing it of people wrestling with which camp they're in right now and trying to keep their head down, but also show and signal socially that they're opposed. And I don't know, it's fascinating to watch. And I don't know what the right response is. I'm obviously in the full-on resistance camp, but I see the complexity here because I don't think this is going away.
John Adams, during the War for Independence, said 1/3 were supported independence, 1/3 supported Britain, and 1/3 kind of went with the wind. And my sense right now is that 1/3 that went with the wind is drifting heavily toward the repression.
I think so too. And I think because built into that, what's required in that is to not look directly at it and to not directly engage with it. And frankly, I feel like these are doing that too, in a different way for the left and for radicals. It's just there's such an onslaught that all of the pressure is on us to look away. And I feel like my fear is in the left and in radical communities that kind of veers towards a hopelessness or dissociating. And I feel like with a lot of other kind of general public, it's what you're saying, that they just look away. And that's becoming, I don't know about you all, but for me personally right now is the hardest thing to see, because I'm seeing just the people I know and people like I've lost touch with over the years, but colleagues, the looking away is just truly appalling.
Talking about the fracturing, the other thing I'm seeing is, just to bring in Luigi Mangione into this, is that I also feel like I see what I would call the institutional left or the professional left, like nonprofits and labor and things like that, definitely looking away, bunkering down, preparing for the next 4 years or longer. But then I'm also seeing, in the case of Luigi Mangione, like a lone wolf, but I'm seeing like more, there's a lot more intensity beginning. He was very obviously a very intense version of this because he's shot somebody, but Aaron Bushnell did self-immolation. Some other people have done self-immolation. We're also seeing like a smaller fracture really just move further away from what was also a norm as well. It's not they're not going to the norm of the right or ignoring it or anything like that. But that's what do you make of that?
No, I think that's pretty spot on. I don't know what to make of it. I mean, I feel like everybody, it's confusing. Like the Luigi case, it's a little confusing. There's a lot that's been said about this and a lot of hot takes on his mix of politics and influences. And at the end of the day, I think it's quite a reflection of where we're at culturally right now. And I think it speaks to the fact that within that kind of institutionalized or like legitimate professional class of people talking about social change, I think we often think that so many of these issues, I don't know quite how to say this, or maybe are not publicly understood or more complicated than the general public is grasping, or that we need to, I guess I'll say it this way. In the environmental and animal protection movements over the years, I've certainly seen a pressure to like, we got to make sure we're staying away from anything that has a hint of a smell of radicalism, right? Whether it's, as you all know and have talked about extensively, anything from vandalizing an SUV to a civil disobedience where you're not telling the cops your plans to get arrested. And so I think this moment, I think, is rattling that for a lot of people of, well, where is the public? Like, where are they? What is the level of outrage and true rage about what's happening? And I don't have the best sense of it, especially coming out of book mode and feeling like I've just been in a cave. I don't really have a sense of the public sentiment, but it does feel like something is really shifting right now.
I don't even know how to make this into a question, but we're currently in a place where environmentally we're seeing fires and bizarre way, like Houston's going to be in the 20s next week, and floods, droughts, everything. And so it's observable. And because of that, didn't State Farm cancel 100,000 policies or something beforehand? And in Texas, you can't get flood insurance anymore. Yeah. On one hand, we have this recognition that there's a real crisis. And on the other hand, we have this political movement to remove any opposition to that, even though State Farm's doing it. So I'm not really sure what I'm trying to ask you, but I think that's a weird dynamic for me.
Yeah, and I think what we're going to see emerge, or I guess what I hope I see emerge, is that both of those narratives are just proceeding full force, right? Like the amount of brazen and explicit articulations of how power is being consolidated, how it needs to be defended, attacks on civil liberties, seeing inflation, income disparity, police shooting of people of color in the street, and soon to be protesters in the street. So as we see that narrative emerge, I think we're going to also see this competing, just utter exhaustion and exasperation at it. And I don't know what that turns into, but it feels like that's the intersection we're heading at, where political organizing and kind of radicalizing people can take place, if that makes sense. I think right now I get the sense that there's a lot of, it's not quite paralysis, but it feels like just being stunned, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for this kind of, is it a fascist regime? Are we waiting for it to kick off? Are we waiting for far-right groups patrolling the streets or roundups. These are the thoughts in my head of what is it we're bracing for and what does this actually look like right now? And to tell you the truth, I go back and forth on a daily basis. I just got done like with the review of this manuscript. I had a team of lawyers helping with it, and we had some really honest conversations that were shocking to me, and that these were like pretty risk averse people, conservative in lifestyle and like a lawyerly kind of thoughtful approach to First Amendment law and press freedom. And they were being very clear about how they think some of the first things under attack in this administration are going to be fundamental press freedoms, going all the way up to the Supreme Court, going after Times v. Sullivan out of the gate. And so that was a shocking moment to me of I feel like I'm chicken little sometimes, right, of what I think is going to happen. And hearing this from those sectors, I think that's a rambling way of responding to your point, Rob, that I think that this is where it's going.
We saw that in the spring with the attacks on the campus protests, which were often being conducted by liberal Democrats and Hochul and Newsom and people like that. So
yeah, and we saw how quickly that happened.
Yeah,
we went from kind of inspirational students are rallying peaceful moment to boots on the throat swinging clubs like very quickly. And I think we need to remember how quickly that happens. The infrastructure is all here. It's been employed and deployed repeatedly, and I think it could be rolled out very quickly.
in 1968, the students took over the dean's office and the administration of Columbia. It took a week for them to call the police in. Well, here it just was immediate.
And it makes me think of, I don't know, I think of Naomi Klein's work a lot, but I think the shock doctrine idea applies to this as well, that once these parties have seen things like the campus occupations, they can accelerate the repression and response. Like it becomes part of the playbook. Authoritarians really like having those kind of flowcharts of knowing if this happens, then this happens. And just having that experience with the student protests, I think, was one of those moments where it was like, okay, this goes into the playbook. As soon as they start putting up tents, we bring out this and roll them out. That's what happened after Occupy too. It got to the point where, you know, you start seeing some of these signs in communities and the police comes out and just tears it down immediately.
That was the playbook they used at Columbia and in my places like that.
Was Occupy?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so too.
It wasn't that far. It wasn't that far back in the past. And the smear campaign, the media and local. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, because the other place where we've seen this sort of behavior is on January 6th, right? And that also represents some level of fracturing, but talking about the third that supports the resistance, the third that supported the state, and the third that went with the wind, is that felt very much like a group of people who embraced some part of the state, though. And I'm wondering how you see that sort of like those right-wing movements, the MAGA movements and everything else fit into that.
It's a great question. I've struggled with that quite a bit because I think there's all of it at once with the right wing right now and with the fascist right in particular. I think there are the absolute true believers, and I think these are some of the folks that have worked their way into the Trump administration, that are influential in the thinking and strategic approaches, the dog whistles, the messaging. We also see that on the kind of the boots on the ground level of some of the folks that were at January 6th were the usual suspects, that if you pay attention to the kind of doxing, or not even doxing, these are just outright public figures, Holocaust deniers, anti-Semites, white supremacists, and avowed white nationalists. But then in that same mix, and this is what I struggle constantly to make sense of, is a large group of folks, a very large group of folks, I think, in this country that have some kind of sentiment of this system is not working, it's not right, this is not okay, and then have veered or been drawn into that direction. And I say I'm like hesitant about that because I don't know how much of them are true believers. And if you even go look at the internet rabbit hole of the people that go up to the Trump rallies and go up to the events like this, there's not a lot of ideological consistency, and there's a lot of room to poke, and to push back and to even see common ground. And so I don't really know what to make of it. I'm hesitant to write all of them off because I don't think we can do that and survive this. I think there has to be an element of trying to meet in some way the most reachable of those folks on the fringes. And I'm not quite sure how to do that because it feels quite scary right now.
When we saw the public response to Luigi, I saw so many people though who said they were Trump supporters. They would comment on like Donald Trump Jr.'s Twitters. It was purely anecdotal. Or Ben Shapiro's was like, I love Trump, I love your dad, or whatever. But then they're like, you're wrong. This guy had it right. That these people at the top of these healthcare companies are monsters and they're doing terrible things. It's some of it's just this level of anger that seems like that we as the left channel in one direction and the right channels in a different direction, but in some ways seems like the same people.
It does. And it feels like a conflict of storytelling to me. It feels like this kind of gaps in the narrative that you're able to exploit a little bit. Because if you look at, and I felt this way even with family, it's hard to tell any working class person, or not even working class, anyone in this country that is not affluent and that does not have healthcare and all of these things like truly figured out and stable, I think, which is most of us. I think it's hard to tell anybody that the system is fair and that the billionaires should be getting the billions. And it's just it's not a tenable conversation. And so I think the only way that the far right can confront that right now is either with denialism, which doesn't really work, with this kind of bait and switch of inserting something else into the media discussion at the same time that's outrageous or that's a distraction, which kind of works, or just doubling down on some of their core talking points, which is, I think, what they did really after the kind of public outrage about the healthcare stuff, is that they just returned to a lot of their repeated talking points and just tried to keep the story going.
Related to that also is we're seeing how like the far, who I feel embraces the state, is responding, but then thinking about how the ruling class is also responding to this moment, which is actually something we talk about on this podcast quite a bit, is we're seeing corporate security really begin to beef up. I'm sure this is a boom moment for private security. This week in San Francisco, JP Morgan Chase had its annual corporate healthcare insurance conference where they put up fences. And we actually had a protest here last year around the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation with Biden and other heads of state. And they put more security up for this healthcare conference than they did even for that. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on like some of the response by the ruling class to this moment.
I'm glad you bring that up. I noticed that alongside the response to the fires in Los Angeles, right? That there's all kind of roundups of tweets and social media posts about the wealthy and the powerful trying to get private firefighters. What do I have to pay to get somebody out here? What do I have to pay to get a helicopter to take me away? And I think we're going to see these are the benchmarks. These are the trends that are going to accelerate. I think we're going to see that not only with security for the wealthiest and the most powerful, but we're going to see it in resources and protection in their like day-to-day lives. And we're going to see that as the ecological crisis gets worse with resources like water and food and kind of basic amenities. I think what that's making clear is that there's just always been this multi-tiered system of accessing these things, and it's just going to get more divided, I think, and more extreme as people are seeing the wealthiest in the world double down on their security when we don't feel safe at all.
We talk a lot about the repression from the state, which is everywhere, right? And they have all kinds of strategies. Can you think of any kind of counter examples where people took that on and found ways, and more recently, and found ways to get beyond that or get behind it or something like that? Because we don't have the power, we don't have the same number of strategies and culture and media, power, armies, all that stuff.
Yeah, that's what's kept me going in this work of really, I've tried to, my guiding thought and this work has been trying to bear witness to this repression and this darkness and sound this warning. But as a consequence of doing that, you also end up kind of bearing witness and being on the front lines of people who are resisting that in ways that often get unnoticed and just forgotten in history. Some of the things I'm seeing now, particularly with the Cop City movement and the amount of disproportionate and kind of overwhelming repression and police violence against protesters. They've used it to respond quite quickly. And I know it's an interesting example because it's like it looks like Cop City is moving forward and there's a lot of difficult things still going on and people awaiting trial and all of this. But seeing how nimble social movements can be in response to this overwhelming repression, I think is a really important reminder that, yeah, it feels like the military, the cops, corporations, access to lawyers, white shoe law firms, you name it. But we're able to be quite quick and thoughtful in our responses. And also, I think part of our greatest strengths are these connections we can make between movements and start seeing patterns, that the patterns are often overwhelming and can feel a little debilitating, but it's important to see the patterns to plan our response. We're seeing that. I'm also seeing that now. It's a slightly different context, but with pretty much every natural disaster, or excuse me, climate disaster that we see, from hurricanes to the wildfires to the people who are responding and out there, like they're being radicalized by this too. They're seeing state services being cut and not fulfilled, and they've seen the importance of community and kind of an affinity group structures of meeting these needs. And I think that's really inspirational as well.
Can I go a quick follow-up? Because you mentioned Cop City, which I would think is really important, and we've done a lot on that. I don't know how wide that story was spread out, but it certainly was nowhere near what Luigi Mangione got, right?
No.
And obviously not the sympathy and the support. Luigi's kind of a folk hero. He's a Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, or something like that. Well, yeah. Is it just because everybody identify with the health insurance industry and has a personal story, whereas Cop City in Atlanta doesn't really resonate? Or like, how can you channel? I have no idea. I'm not asking you for the solution, but has anybody engaged in actions that kind of channeled the kind of response we saw to Luigi on these issues of, climate?
I think it's interesting to think about. It immediately makes me think of the modern emergence of a more radical environmental and also animal rights movement around the 1970s. And the movements at that time, you saw the emergence of Earth First, you saw the Animal Liberation Front. And when I went back in Green is the New Red and I did a content analysis of media coverage and went through all the headlines and the clips, and what I saw was that the news coverage was overwhelmingly positive. And it was describing these activists as environmental warriors, as heroes, as vigilantes. It was a lot of the same framing that you're just describing, right? Like, I think Americans like an outlaw. I think we're raised on him. And I think there was something to that. And that's when, as that rose, that's when the ecoterrorism rhetoric was invented to steer that and to fragment it and to shift public opinion so that all of a sudden it was like, whoa, do you know who you're supporting here? These aren't outlaws and Bonnie and Clyde with stolen animals and saving the trees. These are actually terrorists. And so I think what's wild to me about the Luigi case is like the willingness of the public. All of that stuff was really about nonviolent action or about property destruction. We're seeing the swing to you can't really get more extreme act of a targeted assassination, and the conversation is very different. And so I think I don't know if that makes sense, but it confirms to me some of that research from years ago of, wow, there is an intuitive response and like almost like a living through that or cheering it on that I don't quite know what to make of, but I think people in power see that and understand the threat of it. And especially the decentralized nature of that, the idea that anyone could steal the animal, burn the SUV, take action against the healthcare industry. That's quite a scary proposition.
And do you think that the as far as decentralized action is everything from Earth First, monkey wrenching bulldozers to liberating animals to burning SUVs to taking out a healthcare industry, healthcare CEO? Do you think that the state is, prepared for that, or were they prepared for this? Maybe they were prepared for someone shooting a CEO at some point or another, but were they prepared for the response? Which is to us has been the more interesting part of the story, is the sort of like the level of support and outcry about how bad the healthcare sector was after someone got gunned down.
That is a good question. I'll say this: what I saw after, as I was charting the repression against the radical environmental movement and anarchist movements in particular, and animal rights activists, the FBI and the state more broadly cannot wrap their head around decentralized organizing. If you look at the text, if you look at the reports and the white papers, the best they can do is try to attribute things like the Earth Liberation Front to Louis Beam and like leaderless resistance of white supremacists. Like they're trying to get it and they just don't. And there's been a lot of research and a lot of reports by like counterterrorism experts and FBI and you name it,
The
about
Rand Corporation.
Like the Rand Corporation. Everybody wants to get a check to explain to the government that not everything has to be hierarchical and this is how these radicals are thinking. And I don't think they get it. Like I talked to Mike German a lot. He's a former FBI agent who I met when he was at the ACLU. And he does a great job of describing this because he's just the agents that are dealing with hierarchical militia groups and white supremacists. And not only do they understand their ideology more because it's more closely aligned, but they understand how they think and they're like militaristic structures. And they can't wrap their heads around the anarchists and the environmentalists and the hippies or whatever, right? And so I think that's part of it. I think that might be a little bit separate from them also in this moment not understanding the kind of wider response. I would have to think that they're connected in the minds of whatever joint terrorism task forces and FBI agents are looking at these cases right now, because this is what's emerging, especially of how that kind of spread on the internet was this like, quite decentralized, a little bit anarchist influenced, or at least feeling, right? There's no clear person driving this stuff. And I would think that would have to give a lot of these counterterrorism officials serious pause because they've never cracked it. Like they've never understood how that works. Unless they get informants, or unless they have, even in the Luigi case, they essentially got someone to provide evidence. They got the tip. Unless they get that, or unless they can tighten the screws on someone and get them to become a snitch or an informant, they really don't understand decentralized movements.
The thing about Luigi, and we're not suggesting you should go out and shoot people in the streets, but the response showed that the ruling class was afraid, right? Within days, a couple major insurers changed policies and people in North Carolina got coverage and things like that. So it worked. Are there any examples where that fear led not necessarily to repression, but to actually a bit of a response, a bit of a retreat?
I think it's interesting. I've thought a lot about fear as a political weapon over the
I think
years.
it's huge. I think it's huge.
Yeah, I think we often don't step back and really talk about it in this way, because there is I think we talk a lot about the fear as a tool of repression, right? For those of us paying attention to it. But it becomes real sticky and uncomfortable when we start using that word in talking about social change. And it's really complicated, or my thinking of it has gotten a lot more complicated over the years, because the reality is that even nonviolent social change and mass movements, the point where they are becoming fulcrums and they are really causing widespread social change and institutional change from people in power, from corporations, from politicians, there is this element of fear. The state is afraid of mass movements. The FBI was afraid of the anti-war movement, the Black Liberation Movement, American Indian movement.
Summer of 2020.
Oh, absolutely. It was a
They were
resurgence of all
terrified.
of
They were
that.
terrified. Yeah.
And if you look at summer 2020, the shift to this idea of going after Black radical extremists and this new boogeyman, it was exactly that. It was just like, what just popped off? We don't understand it. And I guess to give the same caveat, I'm not at all, I don't think we should just like wield fear as a weapon, but there's a part of me I think we need to have a more nuanced thinking about this, that social change doesn't come without pressure and it doesn't come without discomfort. And I would even argue it doesn't come without a good amount of fear, both of the individuals fighting for a better world who are having to confront that fear that the state is creating, and also a willingness to say, hey, no, we're not going to go along with this. And if you don't change course, we are going to make it fearful to do business as usual because we might disrupt it.
One of the areas I study, which I actually do know, I think is the 60s, and the state, the FBI and the others were really afraid of two groups, the Black Panthers and VVAW, and they both knew how to use guns. And I've heard people say this. It wasn't just like this, it's just people at the time were saying, like, yeah, you know, VVAW, these guys know how to use guns, and Black Panther, you know, I think that's important.
You see it in with the Panthers in Oakland too. At the point they started displaying firearms publicly, and all of a sudden there was a shift in discussion about attempts with firearm regulation. It's tough because I think we all understand this deeply, and yet it's the people that, like the Panthers and Black Liberation movements, the people who are most at risk that are moved to that level of resistance. And then they inevitably, as you know, in the 60s and in COINTELPRO and the broader aftermath, were hit hardest as well in the repression.
That reminds me of a story about actually a mine who I did climate organizing with, who actually was a Marine vet of Afghanistan. And once he was in the Dallas area, and once it was found out that he had been like a Marine vet and served in Afghanistan, the police and the FBI were like all over him. Yeah, actually, I think there was a story in the Washington Post about him, but it's just their level of that fear is based on something in which they created, really. They're the ones who recruited my friend and trained him and sent him and had him serve in Afghanistan and be in battle. And yet they're afraid of what they created, in a sense.
And I've seen that in FBI documents as well. This characterization of activists that might have connections to people. We saw this in the summer of the 2020 stuff in Denver, some of the work that Trevor Aronson did and the spy files that came out that showed that there is this kind of rhetoric that they use to show how dangerous someone is by linking them to military service. And I think that's a good reminder of how expendable that our Marines and everybody else are treated once you enter the service. It's just, you become a weapon for us to use. And then if you leave and you think differently about anything, then we're just going to use you as a scapegoat to justify whatever we want.
Well, the two New Year Days attacks were done by vets. And so the one in New Orleans, they could play the, Islamic state or whatever. The one in Vegas, they just ignored, but that's never brought up as one of the precipitants. Military service is a good indicator for mass casualty events.
There's even some research that said it's a higher indicator than all this rhetoric of mental health, that these mass shootings are like a mental health issue. And to me, that also speaks to, in the last few years, I don't know, I've ebbed and flowed in social movements a little bit, just because it's like trying to weather it and to keep going and feeling burnt out and all that stuff. And a number of the folks I've met in different circles have come out of the military. And it's been really interesting how much overlap there is. What you're speaking to earlier, Scott, on a lot of things. I think I understand them and they understand me better than some of my activist friends and colleagues do. Yeah. And then there's some moments where I'm just like, what did you just say? What world are we in? And I don't know how to make sense of it. I think the indoctrination of the military is not foolproof. It's not complete. And I think guys come out of there that we shouldn't write off.
Yeah, and this is probably a conversation for another day, but there's a lot of, let's call it, aspects of the left subculture, which are somewhat alienating to folks like that. And those are folks who share our politics and our values. They probably don't have all of the language correct, or they're all a little bit rough around the edges. And I think what left organizers need to do is figure out how to be able to communicate with folks like that, which is, we have a frequent guest who's a friend of ours, who's also a military vet. And he says that all the time. There's so many vets who would be really interested in getting involved in these movements, and they just don't want to come in these left subculture spaces. And that's another thing that the state weaponizes against us, as far as I'm concerned.
I think so too. I've become pretty passionate about this because I think it's connected to where I think is a really flawed discussion right now, talking about men and isolation and masculinity and mental health. And the reality is, I don't know, there's a group of dudes that we worked on motorcycles together, and they're all vets. And I didn't broadcast my politics. I knew what I was about, but we would laugh and hang out and it was fine. And there was one day stuff started coming out more and more. And one of these guys turned to me and he was really affected by it and really had thought about what I said and was engaging with it. And he was just like, man, nobody has ever talked to me like you talk to me. And I didn't know what to make of it at first. And the more I thought about it, what he was really saying was just like, no bullshit, no lefty jargon. Like, yeah. He knew we have all these shared interests. I wasn't judging him and I wasn't policing his language. Like, I was really trying to be friends and find common ground because I thought he was a good dude. And I think there's something there. I mean, to me, was a really radicalizing experience, I think, for both of us, of just like, all right, like, there's something here that we understand each other and we have the same kind of core values. What is all this other shit that's getting in the way of that?
Intellectually or academically, the main area of focus is actually that, is military resistance, or whatever you want to call it. And I've spoken to probably 1,000 vets. And I, like you, I talk about bikes, I've ridden, I talk about sports, stuff like that. And so many have said like what you say, but then I go to these spaces, and I'm going to piss somebody off with this, but they insist I be vegan, or they use the right pronoun. And I don't know if it's true or not, it might be a fable, but that resonates with them. They're like, I'd like to be part of this, but you guys are pushing me away.
And I think we need to hear that. I think you're right. Sometimes that's characterized as like this, like, rejection of all of those things, like not willing to use the pronouns or not willing to have the vegan food. And I think instead, to me, it speaks to just, we all want to feel like we belong and like we have a place there. And so it's almost, can we view each other in a somewhat like childlike way of just, we just want to feel like we're not squares and that we fit in. You don't want to be the one that doesn't understand all this other stuff. When I was a visiting professor at University of Michigan, I had a number of students come to office hours, and I had students from like the business school and computer science and all these weird, like non-activisty backgrounds. And especially a lot of young men would come in and just, their heart was in the right place and they cared about the issues and they wanted to learn, and their minds were blown about some of the stuff we studied. And they were just like, I'm sorry I don't speak up in class. I'm really afraid of saying the wrong thing and people thinking that I'm just a dunce or I'm part of the enemy or something. And that really stuck with me because it's like, I get it. I wouldn't want to kick the hornet's nest accidentally in like an English class at a elite public university. You're going to get torn to pieces. So I don't know. I think if we can just carry that with us a little bit, it might help in these encounters.
Yeah. And right media, YouTube media, right-wing YouTubers, things like that, they prey upon people like that. Whereas I do feel like it's important for the left to be able to talk to those folks or make them feel not like they don't belong.
I think that unless some of us try to confess, this is the prime recruiting ground for fascists. This is the movement that, and what I said before, I don't like the discussion of it because I think it's missing the point. And instead, I'm even seeing backlash on like my social media feeds from like-minded people that are just like, oh, we don't give a shit about this. We don't care. We don't care about male tears. It's about time, the patriarchy. I get it 100%. But at the same time, like if no one else is talking to this enormous group of young people, they're being filtered into the Joe Rogan, Dana White, Elon Musk, Jordan Peterson, now Andrew Huberman, apparently he had Peterson on his show, but that whole world. And
Yeah.
I just think that's where this fascist movement is growing. And that's where really scary stuff starts to happen.
Yeah,
Thanks for
absolutely.
saying that, because I think self-reflection is important, and we don't do that enough.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm getting towards the end of my questions. I don't know if Bob has any
Well,
others.
it's probably similar to what you would ask, which is just what we can look forward to. We're all stunned. We're in the corner for an 8 count, and like, so what do you think is going to happen? Just because you observe this, are people going to go underground and lay low for a while? Do you think there'll be open resistance? Do you think there'll be pockets of resistance? Not necessarily murderers, but Luigi kind of copycats kind of thing.
You want me to just put it out there? I'll put it
Yeah.
out there.
Sure.
Like I'm hesitant because it's easy to make predictions and then not come true. What I'm bracing for is a couple of things. I think from the Trump administration itself, I think we're largely going to see this as a legal assault, going after core press freedoms, constitutional protections, First Amendment law, subpoenas of journalists, all the stuff they're promising. I think it'll be rolled out relative, like on a timeline. I don't think it's going to hit like a D-Day necessarily, but I don't know. Parallel to that, what I don't think people are really talking about is I think the kind of the front lines of that movement are militias, not the Proud Boys or fizzling. And there's a million of these different groups though that are emerging. And I think we're going to see an increase in just like street level violence that we saw in the first Trump administration, but like at the inauguration, I think we're going to see a lot more street fighting white supremacists and the anti-fascists who are brave enough to confront them and to try to slow them down. I think we're going to see a coordinated attack on academics and the press in particular. That's a little bit different than a systemic attack that's going to happen against immigrant and undocumented populations and people of color. But those are always the groups. They've always been hit hardest, and those I think that's going to escalate quite quickly with kind of the nonprofit and academic world, the press, and with immigrants in particular.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see ebbs and flows of this. I don't know what resistance to this is going to look like. That's honestly the harder part for me to predict, and what I'm more reluctant because of things like the Luigi stuff that I never expected. I didn't expect the public response to it. I'm not quite sure what it means or if there's more of that. But I do think in general, not just in the next year, but in the next several years, we're going to see an undeniable increase in underground groups. What I've seen, even going back into the 80s and 90s and 2000s, when with the rise of ecoterrorism making it less and less tenable to do basic civil disobedience in fear of being labeled a terrorist, there were spikes that the FBI observed in underground actions. That kind of went back down because the repression got so big that I feel like it pushed it back down again. But I think that's a natural response in the kind of meandering series of predictions here that I think there's going to be more of that. And there's going to be a lot more of, Bob, like you said, in the first Trump administration, people out in the streets radicalizing. A lot of those folks had never been at protests where they saw a militarized police presence and they saw tear gas and they saw the arrests. And so I think what's going to happen is we'll see an increase in those types of mass protests and then an increase in the people exiting kind of those spaces and being radicalized as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think about J20, 2017. I was in DC and the first day of the new Trump administration, and I had seen tear gas before, but I think there was a lot of tear gas lobbed that day, and I think and flashbangs, and I think a lot of people had never expected to see that, especially in the streets of DC, Washington, DC.
And it goes back to me of this kind of idea of like, it's breaking the spell, right? When the militarized police, like we saw in Portland. God, like the images of Portland looking like this domestic war zone of fashion, like from the 50s or the 30s, of fascists and progressives and anti-fascists fighting in the streets with shields and police lobbing pepper spray. I think scenes like that kind of snapped people in some way out of this dream state of what's happening, what Trump is actually going to do. And no, this is here. This like dystopia is real now. And so I hope there's some of that. I tell myself as a journalist, we have to keep covering this stuff because maybe that helps snap some people out of it.
One thing I wouldn't be surprised in seeing is the rise of more of these paramilitary groups, but actually coordinating with people like Trump, because I'm not sure the military is reliable as them. The military has different kind of factions in it, and 40% of the military is non-white. They have liberals in the media, and I'm sorry, in the military. So I think you're going to see more of these kind of independent kind of para groups.
I think that's undeniable.
Yeah.
I don't think this is going to be, for all the focus on the nomination right now, I think it's important to know if he supports shooting protesters. Obviously, I don't really foresee this being as like a series of Kent states where the military is rolled out. Instead, I think what's going to happen is there's probably going to be a military presence and a militarized presence, but the blood in the streets is going to come from the militia and these paramilitary groups. And I think Trump has made very clear he understands that dynamic, or the people around him understand the history of that dynamic and why it's so beneficial to authoritarians. Because we saw, as Trump got more and more kind of histrionic in his statements, we saw generals making public statements, like breaking ranks, well, not necessarily breaking ranks, breaking their culture a little bit and saying, no, we have core values. Like we have a code. This man has no code. And so I think what we're going to see are these paramilitary groups who have no code and who will do whatever the hell they want. There's not a sense of honor. There's not a following orders. There's not a chain of command. There's a power grab. And I think that's what we're going to see a lot more of.
I have one other question, which is a little bit on the sort of for what you're up to, which is you have a new book coming out, Little Red Barns: Hiding the Truth from Farm to Fable. Can you tell us a little bit about that, which is ready for pre-order?
No, I'd be happy to. It's weird. I'm just turning in the like final edits of the manuscript now. This has been a 10-year project that started as an investigation of new censorship laws that made it illegal for journalists and activists to document factory farms and pollution. And it evolved and it led to an investigation of storytelling and ultimately of fascist groups. And the Little Red Barns are both, it's the narrative that's used to sell us the happy image of the little cows and the little cowboys and farmers. And this is this nostalgic image of America that's packaged up even as farming communities are decimated by corporations. But I realize it's the same image that's being packaged up by the Trump administration to pitch their nostalgic version of Make America Great Again and trad wives and return to traditional values. And so the book really became this attempt to pull apart and understand this narrative and the power of storytelling, of like really keeping us in the dark as fascism rises.
And when will it be out?
It'll be out this June, 2025. And
Awesome.
It's coming out from City Lights in San Francisco, published Green is the New Red. They're also published.
I was there yesterday and I saw it.
Did you really? Oh, that's awesome.
It was like one of the first books there when I walked in. Yeah.
Yeah, it feels good. It feels good. City Lights they have a history of fighting censorship and attacks on social justice movements, and it feels like a good place to be. So that'll be out in June. But yeah, if people want to pre-order, I'm not good at making the hard pitch, but I would appreciate it. Pre-orders are apparently everything right now in publishing. So I appreciate it from folks.
We'll put it in the show notes, the pre-order link.
Yeah. Thank you. I know you're very modest. I don't want to embarrass you, but you've meant a lot to Scott and me and so many other people like that. So
that really means a lot to me, Bob, and to you all as well. I don't know, these last couple of months, man, I'm just like, I'm trying to like visually remind myself. I've thought of you guys. I'm just like, okay, here's the people who are in the fight. Here are the people that have been around for a long time that I know are going to stick around even when it's scary. And I really appreciate you all.
Yeah. Thank you. Folks, we've been talking with Will Potter, journalist and author of Green is the New Red and the forthcoming Little Red Barns. If you like what you hear, and please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listen to us on one of many audio platforms, give us a rate and review because it helps us with the algorithms. And then if you really like us, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And everybody stay safe. It's going to be we're in it for the long haul. So also make a lot of trouble and misbehave. And we'll talk to you again real soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you both, and amen to that.
Yep.